The chamber was built to make visitors feel small. That was not an accident. The Galactic Tributary Council had spent 400 years perfecting the architecture of intimidation. The vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound, the 11 raised platforms where each elder species sat above eye level, the single flat floor at the center where the petition stood alone. No chair, no table, just open stone and 11 pairs of eyes looking down. Every species that had ever stood on that floor had felt it, the weight of it, the design of it. Ambassador Yara Osai felt the floor and thought it needed better lighting. She stood at the center with her hands loose at her sides. She was not tall. She was not dressed in anything ceremonial. Dark trousers, a gray jacket, flat shoes worn soft at the heel. She carried a notebook, actual paper, spiral-bound, the kind sold in packs of 3 at corner shops back home. A pen was clipped to the cover. The herald began the reading at the 9th hour. It would last 3 hours. Yara listened. The formal induction demand of the Galactic Tributary Council was a document that had broken species, not metaphorically. There were civilizations that had fractured under the weight of negotiating it, internal political collapses, resource wars over which faction would bear the tithe, generational debt taken on just to meet the opening offer. The demand was structured that way on purpose. It front-loaded the impossible numbers. It buried the flexible terms in procedural language on page 47. It was designed to make the petitioned party negotiate downward from a position of panic. The herald read every word, all 112 pages, in the formal dialect of council standard, which was itself a language engineered to sound like inevitability. 17% of your annual energy output, 40 vessels of war-class designation, to be crewed by human personnel and placed under council operational authority. Full intellectual property transfer of any technology developed within the last 60 standard years that intersected with the council's defined strategic categories, which, Yara had noted when she read the advance copy, included approximately 83% of everything humans had built since the first contact. And personnel, 200,000 humans voluntarily designated to serve in council auxiliary programs for a minimum of 15 standard years. It was not a membership fee, it was a stripping. The herald finished at the 12th hour. The chamber was silent in the way that large empty spaces are silent when everyone in them is holding their breath. Senior Arbiter Voscale of the Keth delegation looked down from his platform at the human. He had presided over 11 induction proceedings. He knew what came next. The petitioned party would request time. They would ask for clarification on specific terms. They would begin the long, exhausting, face-saving ritual of negotiating down to a number they could survive. Some species wept during this part, not from sadness, from the simple relief of being allowed to bargain. Yara opened her notebook. She wrote something. It took less than 2 seconds. She tore the page out along the spiral edge, folded it once, and held it out to the herald. The herald crossed the floor and took it, unfolded it. Read it. The herald's translator implant, a device capable of processing 11,000 languages and 430 dialects in real time, did not fail on the word. The word was not untranslatable. The implant found it immediately in 17 different human languages, confirmed it, cross-referenced cultural weight and context, and then simply stopped. Not because it could not process the word. Because every species in the chamber already knew what it meant. Humanity's cultural exports had spread far. Their films, their literature, their music, their history, 6 decades of it flowing through galactic networks, consumed by younger generations across a dozen worlds who found human stories strange and compelling and oddly familiar. They all knew the word. The herald looked up from the page. Looked at Yara. Yara had already clipped her pen back to the notebook cover. Voscale leaned forward. From his elevated platform he could not read the page. He was about to ask the herald to read it aloud when the herald folded the page again, very carefully, and held it with both hands. The herald's secondary eyes, the smaller pair, the ones that only opened when something registered as significant, opened. That had not happened in 11 induction proceedings. Vasquez called an immediate recess. The chamber doors opened. Council members rose from their platforms and moved into the private corridors. There was no discussion in the chamber itself. That was protocol. Discussion happened behind walls, in sealed rooms, in the language that did not go on record. Yara Os walked to the side of the floor where a single bench had been placed, the waiting bench, where petitioned parties sat during recess, usually in visible distress. She sat down, opened her notebook to a new page, began writing something else entirely in the small, unhurried handwriting of a person with a list to finish. She looked like someone waiting for a delayed train. In the corridors behind the chamber, the 11 delegations of the Galactic Tributary Council moved fast and did not look calm. Vasquez had been in diplomatic service for 61 years. He had seen species arrive at that floor proud and leave diminished. He had seen empires bend. He had seen species who commanded fleets of 10,000 ships look at the tribune ceiling and feel the specific despair of realizing that power and leverage were not the same thing. He had never seen anyone hand the herald a piece of paper in under 2 seconds. He walked quickly, his robes pulling at the floor, into the primary recess chamber where his delegation waited. 3 senior advisors, 2 military attachés who were technically not here, a junior aide named Seath who was brilliant in the specific way that made Vasquez grateful she was on his side and slightly nervous at all times. They had already gotten the word from the herald's report. Seath said nothing. She was looking at her data panel with an expression that Vasquez associated with the moment before a calculation came back wrong. "They're not requesting time," one of the senior advisors said. "No," Vasquez said. "They're not countering." "No." Then they misunderstood the document. The herald should clarify. They didn't misunderstand it. Vasquez stood at the window that looked out over the station's lower levels, down at the traffic and the freight and the 10,000 small transactions of galactic commerce happening in the space below. They understood every word. She had a pre-reading copy. She's been to 3 council proceedings as an observer. She knew exactly what was on that page. The room sat with that. "Then she's bluffing," the military attaché said, the one who was technically not there. Vasquez did not answer. He was thinking about something in the files he had pulled on humanity last month, when it became clear they would have to be brought before the council. A pattern in the historical record that he had flagged and then set aside because it seemed too simple to be meaningful. Humans did not bluff. That was not idealism. It was a tactical observation. In every recorded negotiation between humans and another party, humans had said what they meant with a consistency that other species found either refreshing or deeply unsettling, depending on whether they were across the table or beside it. They miscalculated sometimes. They overreached sometimes, but they did not say things they did not mean. Which meant the word on that page was not a bluff. Which meant the recess was not going to solve the problem it was called to solve. Seath looked up from her panel. "I think," she said carefully, "we should pull the infrastructure mapping for the Sol relay network." No one asked why. They already knew why. The junior aide pulled the maps, and the room looked at them, and the room became very quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when a number comes back wrong and everyone sees it at the same time, and no one wants to be the first to say what the number means. Vasquez stared at the relay nodes. 14 of them, sitting in human-controlled space, carrying signals for 6 council species who had not thought, when they built their communications infrastructure, to ask who owned the ground underneath it. He thought about the word on that page. 2 letters. He thought about it for a long time. Outside in the main chamber, Ambassador Yara Osei finished her list, capped her pen, and waited with the patience of a woman who had already counted all the relay nodes and simply wanted to see how long it took everyone else to do the same. The sealed recess chamber had not been designed for 11 delegations simultaneously. It was showing. Vascale stood near the far wall and watched the room eat itself. The Dravathi delegation had claimed the long table and were speaking over everyone else with the specific confidence of a species that had never once been wrong about anything and had therefore never developed the ability to consider the possibility. The Soong Collective, 12 identical bodies that shared one distributed mind, had arranged themselves in a tight ring in the corner and had not spoken aloud since arriving, which meant they were communicating internally at a speed that made Vascale's translator give up. The two military attachés who were technically not present were arguing quietly near the door with the Voakai security detail who were also technically not present, and none of them were being subtle about it. Seath stood next to Vascale and kept her voice low. 4 delegations have now requested full copies of the human infrastructure reports. Which 4? The ones most exposed on the relay network. That meant the ones who had the most to lose if humanity's one-word answer held. Vascale looked at his data panel. The relay mapping was still open. 14 nodes. He had memorized the layout in the first 10 minutes, but he kept looking at it the way people look at an injury, not because looking helped, but because the eye kept going back. Pull the full file on Earth's representative, he said. Already running. The file on Yara Osei was not short. She had been in Earth's diplomatic corps for 19 years. Before that, and this was the part that Vascale kept rereading, she had been a labor negotiator. Specifically, she had represented workers in extraction industries, mining, energy, resource processing. She had spent 11 years sitting across tables from entities that had all the structural power and all the money and all the legal frameworks, and she had walked away from most of those tables having gotten what her side needed. She had never once, in 19 years of diplomatic record, made a promise she did not keep or a threat she did not follow through on. Vascale set the panel down. He was beginning to understand that the Herald's translator implant had not hesitated because the word was difficult. It had hesitated because the implant's contextual matrix had cross-referenced the word against Yara Osei's complete negotiating history and flagged a probability that the Council's standard response protocols were not equipped to handle. The implant had, in its own mechanical way, panicked before any of them did. Across the room, the Dravathi senior diplomat, a large, gray-plated individual named Harak who carried authority like a physical object, raised his voice above the general noise. The demand was legally issued under Compact Article 7. Noncompliance has defined consequences. We proceed with those consequences. Define consequences against humanity. That was from the Pulin delegation. Small species, fast minds, historically cautious. I'd like to hear that plan specifically. A collection fleet. Routed through human-controlled space, Seath said, not loudly. She did not need to be loud. The room heard her. Every viable route to Earth passes through at least 2 systems where humans have established infrastructure, trade agreements, or active colonial presence. There is no approach vector that does not require either their cooperation or a conflict that we have not modeled. Harak looked at her. You're a junior aide. I'm aware, Seath said. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room, where the junior aide had just said the thing that all the senior diplomats already knew, and had been hoping someone else would say first, so they did not have to be responsible for saying it. Vascale decided to fill it. Pull the historical contact files, all 3 prior conflict records. I want them displayed. They went through the files one at a time. The room quieted in the way that rooms quiet when the information being presented is worse than expected and better not interrupted. The first record was the Odyssey trade embargo, 22 years prior. The Odyssey, a mid-tier mercantile species with significant council influence, had imposed a full trade embargo on human goods following a territorial dispute over mining rights in the Kesavar Belt. The embargo was legally sound. The Odyssey had the leverage. They controlled 3 major freight routes that human commerce depended on. Humans had responded by building new routes. Not quickly, not dramatically. Quietly, over 8 months, they had identified 17 secondary freight paths that the Odyssey did not control, negotiated access through 4 neutral species who were happy to take the transit fees, and restructured their cargo network. By the time the Odyssey noticed the embargo was not producing the expected economic pressure, human trade volume had actually increased by 6%. The Odyssey had lifted the embargo, not as a concession, as damage control, because they were losing the transit business themselves. The room processed this. The second record was the Voakai blockade. The same Voakai whose security detail was currently standing near the door, technically not present. 14 years ago, a human colony on the edge of settled space had been placed under military blockade following a sovereignty dispute, a legitimate legal action, properly filed. The colony had approximately 40,000 people and limited self-sufficiency. Standard doctrine said a blockade of 8 to 12 months would produce negotiating pressure as the colony's resources declined. Humans had supplied the colony from a direction no one had mapped. There was a route through a navigational dead zone that galactic charts marked as unviable, that human pilots had been quietly using for years. Freight runs, survey missions, the kind of traffic that does not file formal route registrations. They had known about that path long before the blockade and had simply never told anyone. When the blockade went up, supply ships began appearing on the colony's unmonitored side with a regularity that suggested significant prior planning. The blockading fleet had burned through its own fuel reserves waiting for a pressure that never built. After 11 months, they left. The sovereignty dispute had been resolved through an arbitration process that humanity had filed before the blockade even ended. They had been working 2 tracks simultaneously, the practical one and the legal one. Harek was not speaking anymore. The third record was the Soon cultural suppression. The Soon Collective, standing in their ring in the corner, had attempted 40 years ago to limit human cultural exports into their space. Films, literature, music, games, human entertainment had been flowing into Soon territory, and the collective had determined, through internal consensus, that it was creating destabilizing individualist tendencies in younger Soon. An understandable concern. The suppression was legal. They had the authority to regulate imports. Their youth had consumed human culture underground for a decade before the suppression government collapsed under internal pressure from within the Soon network itself. The Soon did not look up from their corner ring. Vosgale thought about the word on the paper again. He thought about it in the context of these 3 files and what they had in common, which was a specific and consistent thing. Humans did not stop. They did not escalate. They did not tantrum. They did not make speeches. They simply continued moving in the direction they wanted to go, around every obstacle, under every wall, through every gap, with the patience of something that had decided the outcome already and was simply waiting for the timeline to catch up. The most dangerous part was not the patience. The most dangerous part was that they were always working on something you could not see yet. We issued the demand publicly, Vosgale said, to no one in particular. The room heard it, understood it. The demand had gone out on open council record. Every species in the settled galaxy had seen it, which meant every species in the settled galaxy was now watching to see what the council did when humanity said no. If the council backed down, they looked like they had no teeth. If they pressed forward, they needed a plan that the last 3 historical records strongly suggested did not exist. Seath was looking at her panel again. She had that expression, the calculation about to come back wrong expression. "What is it?" Vasquez said. "Two delegations," she said, "not from our block. They've sent informal inquiries to the human delegation's comm address." She paused. "They're asking what humanity's terms are." "Not the Council's terms. Humanity's terms." Vasquez looked at the relay maps on his panel. 14 nodes, 6 dependent species, the long table of delegates arguing in a room that smelled of old procedure and new fear. And somewhere in the main chamber, a woman with a spiral-bound notebook and flat, worn shoes, sitting on a bench, waiting with the specific calm of someone who had already written the end of this and was simply letting everyone else catch up to the page. He needed to read that file again from the beginning. All 19 years of it. Because he was increasingly certain that the word on that paper was not an answer. It was an opening move. The word was no. Not a formal rejection filed through council arbitration channels. Not a diplomatic communique with 3 pages of respectful language cushioning the refusal in the center. Not a request for extended deliberation, or a counterproposal, or a plea for modified terms. No. 1 syllable, capital letter, period. Vasquez had been staring at the transcribed text on his panel for 11 minutes. The original page was with the Herald, stored in an evidence archive now, because no one had been quite sure what category to file it under. The Herald had finally logged it under formal response, unprecedented, which was a category that had never been used before and had existed in the filing system purely as theoretical infrastructure. The junior aides who had been in the chamber during the recess were now cycling through the same quiet shock that Vasquez recognized from his own first read. The specific stillness of a person who has received information that does not fit into any existing framework they have been given. Harak, across the long table, had recovered from his earlier silence and was doing the thing he always did when the situation became uncomfortable, which was to make the situation more structured. The response is legally non-compliant. Article 7 provides no mechanism for a single-word refusal. We treat it as non-response and proceed to enforcement timeline. "Tell me the enforcement timeline," said the Poulin delegate, a small voice, persistent. "Collection fleet dispatched within 60 days. Through which route?" A pause. "There are established approach vectors. Name one that does not pass through a system with active human infrastructure." The pause was longer this time. Vasquez set his panel down and looked at the faces in the room. He had a talent for reading rooms. 61 years of diplomatic service had sharpened it past the point of conscious effort. He did not need to think about what he was seeing. It was simply there, the way temperature is simply there. The room was afraid. Not of humanity's military capacity. The humans had ships, good ones, well-built, well-crewed, but the Council's combined fleet dwarfed them. That was not the fear. The fear was simpler and more specific. It was the fear of someone who has just played a card they cannot take back and has realized, too late, that the other player has been waiting for exactly that card. He thought about how to explain this to the younger members of the delegation. Seath would understand already. She had the files. She had done the math. Her expression told him she had been where he was now for at least the last 30 minutes. But the others, the ones who had come up in a council structure where the tributary system was simply the way things worked, where every species paid because every species understood that payment was the cost of belonging. They did not have the context for what a clean no meant. He tried to find the right way in. "In 600 years," he said, and the table quieted for him the way it had stopped quieting for Harak, "the Council has processed 234 induction proceedings. Every species that sat on that floor negotiated. Some took years. Some fought us through 17 rounds of arbitration. Some came back 3 times before they came to terms." He paused. None of them said no. They all understood the consequences. They all had something to protect, Voscale said. That's not the same thing. Species negotiate from fear when they believe that the cost of refusal is higher than the cost of compliance. They run the numbers, they look at our fleet, they look at their own. They look at what we can do to their trade, their communication, their access to galactic systems, and they decide that the tribute, whatever it costs them, costs less than the alternative. He looked at the panel, at the word. Humans ran the same numbers. And they got different results. The room sat with that. Seath had pulled 3 testimony records from the historical contact files. Actual accounts, recorded interviews, formal depositions, diplomatic logs from species that had dealt with humans directly in adversarial contexts. She ran them through the room's display system without asking permission, because Voscale had stopped her from doing things without asking permission approximately 6 years ago after the 3rd time she turned out to be right. The first testimony was from an Oracy freight official, recorded during the aftermath of the failed embargo. The official had been asked by a trade arbitration board to describe the moment the Oracy leadership realized the embargo had not worked. The official said, "We were waiting for them to break. That's what a blockade does, it waits. We had done it before. Every species breaks eventually because every species has a threshold for discomfort. We were waiting for humans to reach theirs. What we did not understand was that they had already decided the embargo was a problem to be solved rather than a pressure to be endured. We were playing a waiting game. They were building a road." The second testimony was from a Volkai fleet commander, the one who had run the blockade on the human colony. Post-action review, filed internally, never meant for outside eyes until a data transfer agreement had released it. Commander wrote, 14 months. I want that number on record. We maintained position for 14 months with full legal authority and complete tactical superiority. The colony never surrendered, not because they had the force to resist us, they did not, but because they had apparently decided before we arrived that surrender was not one of the available options. I have no other explanation for it. They simply behaved as though our blockade was bad weather, inconvenient, to be worked around. I have thought about this many times since. I think the key is that we were trying to make them feel trapped. They never felt trapped. I do not know how to produce that feeling in a species that looks at a sealed door and starts looking for the wall that isn't load-bearing. The third was not a testimony. It was a cultural analysis written by a soon collective researcher during the suppression years, published internally. The relevant passage read, "Human cultural products are not simply entertainment. They are in aggregate a sustained argument. Every story they tell, and they tell an enormous number of stories, contains the same structural claim underneath the surface content, that the individual has agency, that systems can be changed, that the powerful are not inevitable. This is not a political message. It is a foundational assumption so deeply embedded in their narrative tradition that they do not appear to notice it is there. Suppressing their content is therefore suppressing an argument we have already lost, because our youth have already heard it, and the argument made sense to them." Seath stopped the display. The room was quiet in a different way now, not the quiet of fear, the quiet of understanding arriving in a space that had been cleared out by fear. Voscale looked at Harak. Harak was looking at the display where the Volkai fleet commander's words were still visible. "They simply behaved as though our blockade was bad weather." "We issued the demand publicly," Voscale said again. He had said it in the recess chamber. He was saying it again because the room needed to hear it twice to understand the second part of the problem. 640 species received the notification. They all saw the demand go out. They are all watching the proceeding. He let that sit. "If we withdraw the demand, we tell every species in the settled galaxy that the tributary system has a word that stops it. 1 word, 2 letters, and that word is available to anyone willing to say it and mean it." "Then we can't withdraw," Harak said. "And if we press forward, we need a collection fleet, which needs a route, which we have already established does not exist in clean form." Voss-Kale picked up his panel, set it down again. We have built ourselves a very elegant problem. Seath raised her hand slightly, the gesture she used when she had something to say that she was fairly certain would change the direction of the conversation, and was giving him the option to brace for it. He nodded at her. 2 more delegations have contacted the human comm channel, she said. That's 4 now, and one of them is Dravathi. Herrick looked up. Not official contact, Seath said. Informal, personal accounts, junior staff, she paused. But the questions are the same. They want to know what humanity's terms are. Not whether humanity would comply. What humanity's terms were. As if the question had already shifted. As if, in the quiet, in the 4 informal messages sent through personal channels by delegates who were technically just curious, the room had already begun the process of accepting that the word on that paper was going to hold. Voss-Kale thought about the word, about the period after it, the clean full stop. He had been in this work for 61 years. He had learned that most negotiations were really just 2 questions. What do you want, and what are you willing to pay? The whole architecture of the tributary system was built on the assumption that every species, when pushed to the wall, would eventually answer those 2 questions in the direction of compliance. Humanity had answered a different question entirely. Not what will you give up, but what do you actually owe? The answer was nothing, and they had said so in 2 letters, a capital and a period, and then sat on a bench and written their grocery list. Voss-Kale needed to understand what they wanted, not what they would accept, what they actually wanted. He had a feeling it was something the Council should have offered 600 years ago, before the system calcified, before the tribute became extraction, before the galaxy forgot that the compact had originally meant something different than what it had become. He was going to have to read 400 years of founding documents to check. He was also, he realized, going to need to go back to the main chamber and look at the ambassador's face when she was not performing patience. He wanted to know what she looked like when she was simply sitting. He suspected she looked exactly the same. The Council did not admit it was applying pressure. That was the first thing. Formally, procedurally, on the record, nothing was happening. The induction proceeding for humanity was simply in recess, pending clarification of the petition party's response. That was the language. That was what the public-facing Council communication said when the 640 species who had received the original demand notification began sending polite inquiries about the timeline. Recess, pending clarification. Behind that word was a machine running at full speed. The first move was trade route administration. 3 of humanity's primary freight lanes passed through systems where Council member species had customs authority. Those species, without any formal instruction, in a way that could not be traced to a Council directive, began processing human freight with elevated documentation requirements, new forms, additional inspection protocols, verification delays of 12 to 15 standard days per shipment. It was legal. It was framed as routine regulatory update. It was the kind of administrative friction that species applied to each other all the time when they needed to communicate displeasure without escalating formally. The human response came in 7 days. Yara-S office filed updated routing declarations for 42 freight operators, redirecting their primary cargo paths through 2 neutral systems that had no existing agreement with the Council bloc. The transit fees went to the neutral systems. 3 Council species who had been collecting those fees quietly lost a revenue stream they had not thought to protect because they had not anticipated the routes would ever be abandoned. The documentation delays were still in place. They were now delaying cargo that was no longer going through those systems. The second move was the clarification request, formally transmitted through official channels, from the Council's senior administrative body to the human diplomatic delegation. A request to clarify whether the response submitted during the induction proceeding had been subject to a translation or transcription error, given its anomalous brevity. It was not a subtle document. Everyone who read it, and it was read by a great many people, because Council administrative communications were technically public record, understood what it was asking. It was offering humanity a face-saving exit, a way to say that the word had been a mistake, a miscommunication, and now they would submit a proper formal response. It arrived on Yara's desk on a Tuesday morning. Her reply came back the same afternoon. It was a single page. At the top in Council Standard, the formal response header. Below it, the word written out by hand. In 11 languages. One for each Council member species. Each translation verified by a certified linguistic expert. The certifications were appended. The Dravathi translation, the Keth translation, the Soon translation in each of the 4 Soon regional dialects, all 11. All the same word. Vos-Kale received a copy and read it 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand, because he was trying to decide how to feel about someone who had clearly prepared this document before the clarification request had even been sent. She had known they would ask. She had prepared the answer in advance. She had waited to see how long it would take. 11 languages, certified, filed within hours of receiving the inquiry. The document had been sitting in a folder on her desk, already done, the whole time. The third move was military posture, the most careful move, the one that had the most deniability built into it. 2 Council fleets, the Dravathi Third and the Keth Border Authority, filed standard navigational updates repositioning their vessels. New patrol coordinates, routine readjustment of defensive perimeters. The new coordinates placed both fleets at the edge of human-controlled space. Not inside it, not a violation, just near, just visible. The way a large person can stand near a door without blocking it while making it very clear that the door is being thought about. The repositioning was not announced. It was filed as internal navigational data. Earth's Office of Astronomical Observation published the fleet coordinates within 36 hours. Public release. Formatted as a navigational safety notice for civilian shipping. Here are the locations of large military vessels. Please route accordingly. Courteous, helpful, thorough. Attached to the notice was a politely worded press advisory to 17 independent galactic news organizations, inviting them to assign correspondents to monitor the situation, with a note that human space would remain open to credentialed press at all times. The Dravathi Third Fleet was now being watched by journalists. The Keth Border Authority quietly filed new navigational updates. The coordinates moved. Vos-Kale watched all 3 moves land and watched the responses come back, and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has realized that they have been playing the wrong game. Not a game they were losing, a game whose rules they had assumed were the same for everyone and had turned out to apply only to one side. The Council applied pressure. Humanity documented it, rooted around it, and published it. Every time. They were not fighting the pressure, they were filing it. He thought about the Voakai fleet commander's words. They simply behaved as though our blockade was bad weather. He had read that testimony and thought he understood it. He understood it differently now. The commander had framed it as a psychological mystery. How do you produce a feeling of entrapment in a species that looks for the gap in the wall? But it was not a psychological mystery. It was a structural one. You could not trap something that had already mapped every exit before you arrived. Seath came to find him on the station's outer observation deck, which was where he went when the recess chamber got loud, and he needed to think in a space that did not have 11 delegations in it. She had a panel and the expression. 6, she said. 6 what? 6 delegations with open communication to the human channel now. Dravathi is still informal, but the Poolen delegation sent an official query. She paused. Through their foreign ministry, not council channels, direct bilateral contact. Vas-Kale looked at the stars through the observation glass. The relay network was out there. He could not see it, of course, but he knew where it was. He had memorized the map. 14 nodes threading through space like stitches through fabric, holding things together that would come apart without them. What did the Poolen ask? Same question everyone's asking. Seath read from her panel. What are humanity's terms for engagement with the galactic community? Not for compliance, for engagement. The framing had shifted. In the space of 2 weeks, without a single formal statement from Earth, the question the Council had been asking, when will humanity comply, had been quietly replaced by a different question that 6 delegations were now asking directly to humanity's own channels. What do you want? What did she say? Vas-Kale asked. Osai, what did she tell them? Seath read, equal standing or no standing, mutual agreement or no agreement, respect or nothing at all. Vas-Kale let that sit. It was not a demand. It was a description. Humanity was not telling the Poolen what they required as a condition of negotiation. They were describing what they already were, what they had already decided they were, and nodding that any arrangement that started from a different premise was not an arrangement they were available for. It was the same word as the paper, really, just expanded into a sentence. No, but here is what yes would look like. He thought about the founding documents he had been reading, 400 years of them. The original compact language, before the tributary clauses had been introduced, before the system had shifted from partnership into tithe. There was a phrase in the original preamble that appeared in the translated human version that had been submitted at humanity's first contact hearing, 40 years ago, before Vas-Kale's time. He had found it in the archive. All parties to this compact enter as contributors, not supplicants. Someone had changed that. Somewhere in the procedural amendments of the last 3 centuries, contributor had become petitioned. The word supplicants had been removed and replaced with applicants. Small changes. The kind that happen slowly in committee, in rooms where everyone already agrees that the current structure is fine. He turned away from the observation glass. I need to request a private meeting with the human delegation. Seath looked at him, not through the council. No, not through the council. Vas-Kale. I know what it looks like. He picked up his own panel. I need to know what she actually wants, not what she's willing to fight for, what she came here to get on the day she packed that notebook. Because he was beginning to see it now. The shape of it. The reason for the patience, the prepared documents, the 11-language reply, the press advisories, the quiet rerouting of freight lanes. Yara Os had not come to the council to survive the proceeding. She had come to change it. And she had been moving toward that outcome since before the first herald read the first word of the demand, while everyone in that chamber had been looking at her worn shoes and her spiral notebook, and deciding she was not prepared. She was the most prepared person in the room. She had just been waiting for the room to figure that out. Vas-Kale sent the message from his personal comm unit. Not encrypted. There was nothing in it that required encryption. It simply said that he was requesting a direct conversation with Ambassador Osai at a time of her convenience, outside of formal proceeding structure, and that he was making the request as an individual rather than as council arbiter. He sent it at night, station time, when the recess chamber was finally quiet. Her reply came back in 4 minutes. It said, tomorrow, 7th hour. There is a canteen on level 9 that makes something they call coffee. It is not good, come anyway. He arrived exactly at the 7th hour. She was already there at a corner table away from the main seating, her notebook open, a cup of the coffee dark, slightly wrong-smelling on the table beside it. A second cup was waiting across from her. He sat down. He picked up the cup. He drank some of the coffee. It was not good. He set it down and looked at her and decided the only way to do this was to not be a diplomat. "What do you actually want?" he said. Yara Os looked at him the way she had looked at the herald when she handed over the paper, calm, measured, without any performance in it. Then she turned her notebook around so he could see the page she had opened. It was a table, columns of information handwritten. He leaned forward to read it. The left column was a list of infrastructure projects. He recognized them: relay nodes, trade route development, the navigational mapping system that covered the outer settled systems, the Galactic medical data network. The right column next to each project had two numbers. The first number was the percentage of the project's foundational architecture, built by human engineers. The second number was the percentage of ongoing maintenance, currently performed by human personnel. He read down the table. He did not finish his coffee. 41% of the relay network's foundational design had come from human engineers who had been contracted as junior partners 40 years ago. 63% of current maintenance crews on those nodes were human. The navigational mapping system, the one every species in the settled galaxy used for transit plotting, had been built on mathematical frameworks developed by 3 humans whose names appeared in the original project documentation as consultants. The medical data network, the deep-range communications protocols, the cargo container standardization system that allowed freight to transfer between ships of different species without modification. Each entry had its numbers: human contribution, human maintenance, human foundation. He looked up. "Nobody paid you," he said. "We were paid," Yara said. "Consulting fees, junior partner rates. 20, 30, 40 years ago when we were new and didn't know what these systems would become." She picked up her cup. "By the time we knew, the contracts were done and the credit had settled elsewhere." He sat back. He was thinking about the founding documents again. Contributor, not supplicant. He was thinking about how a word gets changed in a committee, slowly, over centuries, and how a system that began as partnership becomes extraction without anyone making a single dramatic decision to make it so. Just small amendments, reasonable adjustments, the drift of language under the hands of people who benefited from the drift. "The tribute demand," he said. "Was a bill sent to someone who helped build the building," she said. "Yes. You could have said that in the chamber. I said it in 2 letters and let you all look it up yourselves." She set down her cup. "You needed to look it up. If I had walked in with a speech and a presentation, you would have argued the numbers, because you would have been arguing with me. This way you found the numbers yourselves. You can't argue with something you found." He thought about Seth's expression in the recess chamber. The calculation coming back wrong expression. The 6 delegations that had quietly opened private channels to the human diplomatic office, not asking when humanity would comply, but asking what humanity actually wanted. She had not moved the delegations away from the council. She had let the council's own pressure campaign do it. Every administrative delay, every fleet repositioning, every clarification request, each one had been documented, published, and sent to 640 species on the open record. Each one had made the council look smaller. He had spent his career understanding leverage. He was looking at someone who understood it at a different level entirely. "What do you want?" he said again. Not the opening question this time, the real one. "A seat at the table we helped build," she said. "Not charity membership, not modified tribute terms. Genuine standing in the compact, with contribution recognized as the basis for participation rather than payment." She turned the notebook back toward herself. "And a restructured framework for every species currently under the tributary system, not just us." He looked at her. "Every species. The system is broken for everyone. We're just the ones who looked at the bill and had enough structural leverage to say so." She wrote something in the notebook without looking up. "Fix the system, Or we'll be back here in 100 years having this conversation with someone else, maybe with a species that's angrier than we are. He thought about that. He thought about humanity's characteristic patience, the thing the Volkai commander had written about, the thing the Odyssey freight official had described, the thing the Soon researcher had tried and failed to suppress, the quality that was not stubbornness or pride but something more foundational, a deep decision made somewhere in their history that the way things were was not the same as the way things had to be. They were not demanding, they were describing. Here is what is wrong. Here is what correct looks like. Here is what we will do in the meantime. Here is the door, open 1 inch if you want to walk through it. The compact founding documents, he said. I have them, she said. She pulled a folded set of papers from between the notebook pages, actual printouts, annotated in red pen. She laid them on the table. The original preamble language, before the amendment series of the 3rd century, before contributor became applicant. She tapped a paragraph. It was better then. It can be better again. We don't need to rebuild from nothing. We need to go back to what was there before the committees got to it. He picked up the documents. He read the annotated sections. He read the paragraph she had marked, the original language, and he felt something shift in the way that things shift when you have been looking at a problem from one angle for a very long time and someone quietly rotates the frame. It was not a new idea. It was the original one. The council convened its final session on the human induction, proceeding 8 days later. 3 species had formally withdrawn from the Tribute Coalition before the session opened. 2 more abstained from the vote. The motion to enforce the demand against humanity when it came to the floor received 4 votes in favor. It needed 9. The demand was formally withdrawn. The motion that replaced it, the framework for the mutual compact, a replacement structure for the tributary system, authored jointly by humanity, the Poolen, the Dravathi reformist bloc, and 2 other species who had been quietly sending messages through personal channels, passed with 7 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, and 2 against. It would take years to implement. There would be arguments about the specific terms for every species currently under the old system. There would be committees and amendments and a great deal of procedural language before it settled. But the language at the top of the founding document, the preamble of the new compact, was the old language, the original. The words from before the committees had drifted it. All parties enter as contributors, not supplicants. Voss-Kale submitted his formal post-proceeding record that evening, as was his practice after every proceeding he had chaired. He wrote his summary of events, his assessment of the outcome, his recommendations for future council protocol. At the end of the record, in the section reserved for arbiters' notes, he did something he had never done in 61 years of proceedings. He retrieved a copy of the original page from the evidence archive, the one the Herald had carried across the floor. He looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote his notes directly below the human ambassador's word. The note was 1 word. Understood. He filed the record and sat for a moment in his office in the quiet of the station at night. He thought about a woman with a worn notebook and flat shoes sitting on a waiting bench and writing her grocery list, while the most powerful diplomatic body in the settled galaxy ran through every file they had on her people, and felt the specific vertigo of realizing that the architecture of their power had a load-bearing wall they had never noticed. He thought about a word with 2 letters and a period. He thought about how it had not been defiance. Defiance is loud. Defiance wants to be seen refusing. Defiance arrives with a speech. What Yara Osai had put on that paper was something quieter and much harder to argue with. It was a fact. The word was no, and the word meant, we know what we built, we know what we are owed, we know what you need from us, and we have already decided that this is not the shape this relationship will take. The rest was just paperwork. She had known that from the moment she packed the notebook. He closed his record and turned off his desk light and decided, for the first time in his career, that he had been in the presence of something he had not been trained to recognize. Not a superior negotiator. Not a more powerful faction. Just a species that had looked at an old, broken system and simply refused to pretend it wasn't broken, and had the patience to wait quietly with their coffee while everyone else caught up.